Jane Harp was a trusted figure in the community, a treasurer known for her diligence and dedication to her work at the local church. But one fateful morning, everything changed. Jane was found dead in her office, strangled with no signs of struggle. Her office, normally a hub of activity, was eerily calm. Nothing appeared out of place. The church's safe was wide open, but the church books, vital to the church's financial records, were missing. As detectives arrived on the scene, they were immediately struck by one unsettling detail. There were no fingerprints to be found anywhere. Every surface had been meticulously cleaned. But the scene wasn't as flawless as it appeared. When luminol was sprayed on the floor, a faint but unmistakable shoe print appeared, an imprint left behind from a rare, discontinued brand. What seemed to be a clean, straightforward crime began to unravel in strange and unexpected ways. No one had seen or heard anything that could explain Jane's death. The only clue, a partial shoe print, would become the starting point in a case that would expose months of financial manipulation, hidden motives, and a betrayal too close to home. With only this faint print to go on, detectives now had to uncover the truth, piece by piece, in a web of deceit that had been carefully crafted and buried in Jane's own office. Jane Harp was more than just the treasurer of the local church. She was a pillar of the community. For years, Jane had handled the church's finances with precision, earning the trust of her colleagues and the respect of the congregation. To those who knew her, she was the embodiment of reliability and integrity, someone whose word was as solid as the figures she balanced each day. Her position was one of great responsibility, managing both the church's funds and the records that supported its charitable work. This role, though rewarding, came with pressures. The church, a cornerstone of the community, had grown, and the financial obligations were increasing. But through it all, Jane maintained her calm and methodical approach, ensuring that everything was accounted for and transparent. Her tragic death left the church reeling. Questions began to surface almost immediately. Who could have done this to Jane? Was it someone from the inside? Someone who had access to the church's records? And what had Jane uncovered that might have led to such a violent end? As the investigation unfolds, it becomes clear that Jane's death was only the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the surface of this seemingly tranquil community was a web of deception that no one could have predicted. For more in-depth coverage and to stay updated as the investigation continues to unfold, be sure to subscribe to Beyond the Evidence. Our team will take you deeper into the story and provide exclusive insights into the twists and turns of this tragic case. Jane Harp's death sent shockwaves through the church community, but for those who worked closest with her, the grief was compounded by a growing sense of suspicion. Within the financial team, Jane had built an atmosphere of trust, but the nature of her position meant that there were always those who felt the pressure. The church's finances were vast, and Jane was the gatekeeper to that world. Among her colleagues, there were 3 individuals who stood out in particular. First, there was Peter, the senior accountant, who had worked alongside Jane for over a decade. His position allowed him considerable access to the church's financial records, and while he was known to be dependable, some whispered about his growing frustration with Jane's tight control over the finances. Though Peter had always been respectful, his relationship with Jane had begun to strain in the months leading up to her death. The church's growth had led to more financial responsibilities, and Peter's dissatisfaction with his role seemed to coincide with the unexplained discrepancies that would later emerge in the financial records. Next was Sarah, the church secretary, who had handled much of the administrative work that supported Jane's role. Sarah was a quiet, reserved figure who had always deferred to Jane's authority. However, in the weeks before the murder, there were signs that Sarah was under increasing pressure. The church was undergoing audits, and Jane had been particularly meticulous in ensuring everything was accounted for. Sarah's workload had grown heavier, and some wondered if she felt burdened by Jane's perfectionism. Her loyalty to Jane was unquestioned, but her relationship with the other members of the team had grown tense, particularly as internal audits became more frequent. Lastly, there was Thomas, the church's head of security, who had known Jane since they were both young. His protective nature had earned him a trusted position within the church, and though he was not directly involved in the church's finances, his proximity to the team made him a key player in the dynamics at play. He was often seen talking with Jane, and his loyalty was evident in his efforts to ensure the church's physical security. But like Sarah, there were whispers, small remarks made about his growing involvement in church affairs, particularly in areas that were usually off-limits to him. The church's financial team, once united in their goal to maintain transparency and integrity, was now a web of tension and unease. Each person, though seemingly dedicated to their role, had their own secrets, frustrations, and ambitions. It was within this fragile web of relationships that the cracks began to show. As the investigation unfolded, it became increasingly clear that the tension between Jane and her colleagues might have been more than just professional. Underneath the surface, personal motivations and simmering resentments had begun to build, a perfect storm waiting to erupt. The moment Jane Harp was found dead in her office, it became clear that something far more sinister was at play than a simple act of random violence. Her death, initially thought to be a tragic accident or a result of a personal vendetta, quickly began to take on the characteristics of a carefully planned crime. The question wasn't just about who had killed Jane, but why and how it had been orchestrated with such precision. As investigators combed through Jane's office, they began to notice discrepancies in the church's financial records that had been overlooked in the days prior. Missing money, discrepancies in account balances, and irregular transactions seemed to suggest that something was amiss. It was as if Jane had been hiding something, or perhaps had been caught up in a scheme she hadn't yet been able to expose. But no one had noticed the subtle signs until it was too late. Months of what seemed like innocent financial transactions now appeared suspicious in hindsight. A closer look at the church's books revealed that funds had been siphoned off little by little, with careful alterations to receipts and records, enough to avoid immediate detection, but still enough to create a substantial loss. The amounts were small enough to be overlooked initially, but in total, the figures added up. The more the investigators dug, the more it became clear that Jane had been a victim of a financial scheme, one that had been running under her nose for months. The question was, had Jane been complicit in this embezzlement, or had she unknowingly become part of the deception? The timing of the irregularities also raised eyebrows. They appeared just before Jane's death, coinciding with a period of personal stress within the church's financial department. The pressure of maintaining transparency and the looming audits could have caused even the most diligent of workers to cut corners. Was Jane trying to cover up the discrepancies, or had she been unaware of them until it was too late? The investigation soon focused on the financial transactions that had taken place just before Jane's death. Small, seemingly insignificant amounts were being moved between accounts, transfers that were meticulously disguised under the guise of routine administrative work. In one instance, a large sum was moved from the church's operating fund to a private account, but the transaction was buried in a mountain of paperwork, hidden behind legitimate expenses. As the signs of foul play mounted, investigators began to connect the dots between Jane's death and these financial irregularities. The missing money and the timing of the alterations suggested that the motive for her murder might not be as personal as originally believed. Was Jane murdered to cover up a financial crime, or had she become a casualty of someone else's greed? With these early warning signs pointing towards something much darker than initially suspected, the case took on a new direction. The investigation shifted focus from a simple murder to a complex web of financial fraud, and the list of potential suspects grew longer as the motive behind the crime began to come into sharper focus. As investigators dug deeper into Jane Harp's death, the case began to take on a new, more disturbing direction. What had initially appeared to be a simple murder investigation quickly became entangled with a complex web of financial fraud. Jane, once seen as a model of integrity, had been keeping secrets that, if revealed, could have brought down the entire financial structure of the church. The first major breakthrough came when financial records from the church were examined with a fine-tooth comb. Detectives found evidence of months of quiet embezzlement, funds funneled into accounts that had no legitimate purpose. The amounts had been small enough to evade detection for a while, but over time, they accumulated into a substantial sum. These illicit transfers, buried under layers of legitimate transactions, had been masked by fake receipts and altered records. It became clear that someone with intimate knowledge of the church's financial operations had been siphoning money without raising suspicion. The investigation soon turned to the staff members who had access to these financial records. Peter, the senior accountant, came under increasing scrutiny. His relationship with Jane had been strained in the months leading up to her death, and some of the discrepancies in the financial records coincided with his oversight. His frustration with Jane's tight grip on the church's finances had been no secret to those who worked closely with him. He had frequently expressed dissatisfaction with the increasing complexity of their financial operations, and as the investigation unfolded, it appeared that this frustration may have led him down a dangerous path. But it wasn't just Peter who was under suspicion. Other staff members had also become involved in the web of deception. Sarah, the church secretary, had been responsible for many of the administrative aspects of the financial records. She had grown increasingly overwhelmed by the audits and the pressure to ensure everything was in order. But as investigators examined her digital footprints, they found evidence that suggested she had altered records herself. Late-night logins to the church's financial system and questionable changes to receipts painted a picture of someone who had crossed the line in a desperate attempt to cover up the crime. However, it was the discovery of a rare discontinued brand of shoe print in Jane's office that would ultimately turn the case around. This seemingly small piece of evidence, revealed through the use of luminol, would lead to a breakthrough in the investigation. The print, though partial, was distinctive enough to suggest that the perpetrator was someone with access to the church's inner workings. A person who would have known Jane's office well enough to enter undetected and carry out the crime with such precision. As forensic teams scoured the office for additional clues, they uncovered fibers from the carpet in Jane's office embedded in the sole of the shoe. This connection was critical. The rare shoe print was tied directly to the perpetrator, and the fibers on the shoe would ultimately become a key piece of the puzzle. In the days that followed, investigators focused their attention on individuals who had been in the church recently and who might have worn shoes that matched the print. This led them to one of the church's accountants, an individual whose access to Jane's office and financial records made them a prime suspect. The evidence was mounting. Altered financial records, midnight logins, a rare shoe print, and fibers linking the suspect directly to the crime scene. What had begun as a murder investigation now seemed like a carefully orchestrated crime, with a motive rooted in financial greed. Jane's death was no longer just a tragic loss. It was a deliberate act of violence, committed to cover up months of embezzlement and fraud. The crime was becoming clearer by the day, but the true extent of the betrayal was still yet to be fully understood. The discovery of Lena Harp's body in her office sent a ripple through the entire church community. Lena was more than just the treasurer. She was a trusted figure, a cornerstone of the organization, and her death felt like a personal betrayal to everyone who had known her. As news of her murder spread, grief quickly turned to confusion and suspicion. The question on everyone's mind was simple: who could have done this to Lena? In the hours following the discovery, the church leaders were left scrambling for answers. The sudden and violent loss of someone so central to the church's daily operations created a vacuum of uncertainty. Without Lena, no one knew exactly where the church stood financially. Her meticulous records and careful oversight had ensured that everything was in order. But now that structure was gone, leaving behind a mess of unanswered questions. As the investigation progressed, the community's reaction shifted from disbelief to growing unease. The church members, who had once trusted Lena completely, began to ask uncomfortable questions. What was going on behind the scenes? Had there been things Lena hadn't been able to share, or had she been hiding something from the rest of the team? Lena's colleagues were the first to be affected. Peter, the senior accountant, was visibly shaken. He had worked closely with Lena for years, and their relationship, though professional, had begun to deteriorate in recent months. Some of his frustrations with Lena's handling of the finances had been well known. But as the investigation into Lena's death revealed the scale of the embezzlement scheme, Peter's reaction seemed to shift. What had initially appeared as shock and grief soon gave way to a coldness that seemed out of place for someone who had worked so closely with Lena. Sarah, the church secretary, had always been a quiet, reserved presence in the church office. She was devastated by the loss of Lena, but her grief was tinged with suspicion. As more details of the crime emerged, it became clear that Sarah had also been involved in some of the financial discrepancies. The late-night logins to the church's financial system, the altered receipts, all signs pointed to Sarah's potential involvement. But it wasn't just her actions that raised suspicions. It was her reaction to the investigation. She seemed uneasy in a way that was hard to ignore, constantly shifting under the weight of the investigation's growing intensity. And then there was Thomas, the church's head of security. He had known Lena for years, and his loyalty to the church was unquestioned. But in the wake of Lena's death, Thomas's role within the investigation began to take on an increasingly prominent place. The more detectives looked into his involvement with the church's day-to-day operations, the more they began to question how much he knew about the events leading up to Lena's murder. As the investigation moved forward, the emotional fallout from Lena's death continued to unfold. People who had once considered Lena a friend and confidant were now forced to confront the possibility that someone close to her, someone from within her own team, had played a part in her death. Trust, once taken for granted, had become a fragile thing. The sense of community that had once bound the church together now felt shattered, with every interaction tinged with suspicion. The impact of Lena's murder stretched beyond just her colleagues. Church members who had known her for years were left questioning their own ability to trust. If Lena, the trusted treasurer, could be betrayed by someone so close to her, then who else within the church's inner circle might be hiding their own secrets? The entire congregation was now facing an uncomfortable truth. There was a murderer in their midst, and it was someone who had been trusted to uphold the very values the church preached. The emotional toll of Lena's death was immeasurable, but it wasn't just the personal loss that weighed heavily on those involved. It was the realization that the investigation was not just about a murder, but about exposing a far-reaching web of financial deceit. As the evidence began to pile up, it became clear that Lena's death wasn't an isolated incident, but the tragic result of something much larger and more insidious. The community, once filled with faith and trust, now found itself grappling with the darkest of betrayals. The discovery of the rare shoe print, the altered receipts, and the growing list of suspects were all pieces of the puzzle. But the emotional aftermath of Lena's death was something no one could have predicted. As the investigation continued, Lena's colleagues and the church community were left to pick up the pieces, forced to confront the reality of what had happened and the painful truth that someone they had trusted had killed her in cold blood. As the investigation into Lena Harp's murder continued, the initial shock began to give way to methodical detective work. The key breakthrough came when forensic teams, after hours of combing through Lena's office, discovered a rare shoe print left behind at the crime scene. It was a partial print, but distinct enough to be of significant importance. The print, found under the flicker of luminol, revealed a mark from a rare discontinued brand of shoes that were no longer sold on the open market. Detectives quickly focused their attention on the limited number of people who could have had access to these shoes, narrowing the list to individuals within the church who might have been in close proximity to Lena's office. The rarity of the brand suggested the perpetrator was someone with a specific connection to Lena's workplace or personal life, someone who had been there before, who knew the layout of her office, and could operate without raising suspicion. The shoe print wasn't the only piece of forensic evidence that would prove pivotal in solving the crime. Investigators also discovered fibers from the carpet in Lena's office embedded in the shoe sole, connecting the perpetrator directly to the crime scene. These fibers, carefully analyzed in the lab, would serve as a direct link to the individual who had been there the night Lena was murdered. As the forensic evidence mounted, detectives turned their attention to the financial records that had seemed so suspicious from the outset. Months of embezzlement, carefully concealed behind fraudulent receipts and false entries, painted a picture of someone with intimate knowledge of the church's financial systems. The funds had been siphoned off in small amounts, gradually adding up over time. What began as a few $1,000s here and there had turned into a significant sum. But who had the knowledge and the access to carry out such a scheme? The investigation's focus turned to Peter, the senior accountant. He had worked alongside Lena for over a decade, and the tension between them in recent months had not gone unnoticed. His frustration with Lena's tight control over the church's finances had been palpable, and it became clear that Peter had been in a position to manipulate the records. But it wasn't just his professional frustrations that made him a prime suspect. It was the mounting evidence against him. Peter's digital footprint revealed a series of midnight logins to the church's financial systems, occurring after hours when no one else would have been around. These logins corresponded with the times when fraudulent transactions were made. Additionally, investigators uncovered forged receipts linked to Peter's user account. His involvement in the financial discrepancies was undeniable. As detectives pieced together the timeline, they saw a clear picture emerging. Peter had been embezzling money from the church, and Lena had either discovered or was close to discovering the scheme. But it wasn't just the financial fraud that pointed to Peter. It was the rare shoe print. Investigators now had a key piece of evidence that would tie him to the crime scene. The fibers from Lena's office carpet on Peter's shoes were enough to push the investigation over the edge. His access to Lena's office, his role in managing the finances, and the mounting forensic evidence painted a damning picture. With the shoe print and the digital evidence aligning, the investigation reached its climax. It became clear that Peter had not just been embezzling funds from the church, but had also been desperate enough to kill Lena to keep his secret buried. The murder, while brutal, had been an act of self-preservation. Lena had discovered his crimes, and in an attempt to prevent her from exposing him, Peter had taken drastic measures. As the full scope of the crime began to unfold, the church community was left in shock. The betrayal was not just financial, it was deeply personal. The person who had been trusted with the church's finances had been hiding a dark secret, and when Lena came too close to the truth, her life was taken to protect it. The investigation, though ultimately successful in uncovering the truth, left behind a trail of destruction. The betrayal by one of their own shattered the trust that had once bound the church together. And for Lena, the woman who had faithfully managed the church's finances, the price of truth had been far too high. The arrest of Peter, the senior accountant, sent shockwaves through the church and the entire community. The discovery that the man who had been trusted with the church's financial integrity for years was behind not only the embezzlement, but also Jane Harp's brutal murder left the congregation in a state of disbelief. Peter had been a familiar face, someone many had relied on, and his betrayal cut deep. But what had once been a trusted role in the community had now become the symbol of a tragic collapse of faith and security. As the investigation wrapped up, Peter faced charges of both financial fraud and murder. The evidence was overwhelming. The altered financial records, the midnight logins, the forged receipts, and ultimately, the forensic evidence linking him to Jane's office on the night of the crime. The rare shoe print and fibers from the office carpet were enough to conclusively tie him to the murder scene. Jane had uncovered his embezzlement scheme, and in a desperate attempt to protect himself, Peter had resorted to killing her. The sheer ruthlessness of his actions, murdering someone he had worked with for years to cover his crimes, was incomprehensible to many. The trial that followed was a painful affair for the community. The church members, many of whom had worked closely with Peter and trusted him implicitly, were forced to confront the grim reality of his actions. The financial impact of his embezzlement was staggering, and the loss of Jane, someone many had seen as a pillar of their church, felt irreparable. As details of Peter's motives came to light, the gravity of the crime began to settle in. His greed had led him to destroy everything he had worked for, sacrificing a life and his own future to hide his wrongdoings. But for Jane's family, the aftermath was even more profound. Her tragic death had left a hole in their lives that could never be filled. Jane had been a dedicated professional, someone who had always put others first. To think that her life had been taken because she had tried to do the right thing, uncovering the financial wrongdoings within the church, was a bitter pill to swallow. Her family had been left to mourn not only her loss, but the circumstances surrounding it. Jane had not only been the victim of a crime, she had become a symbol of the dangers of blind trust and the lengths to which some would go to protect their secrets. For the church community, the consequences were far-reaching. Trust had been shattered, not just in the financial department, but in the very fabric of the church's leadership. Members who had once placed their faith in the institution were left questioning the integrity of those they had once trusted. The fact that a trusted member of the financial team had hidden his criminal activities for so long left the congregation in turmoil. They were forced to re-examine their understanding of loyalty and responsibility within the church. The betrayal was not just about money. It was about the very foundation of their community. As the trial came to a close and Peter was sentenced, the church was left to rebuild. Jane's legacy, however, was not one of shame, but of sacrifice. She had uncovered a truth that had been buried beneath layers of deceit. Her efforts to protect the integrity of the church had cost her everything, but they had also uncovered a dark reality that might have gone unnoticed for much longer. In the end, the murder of Jane Harp was not just a crime. It was a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power, the fragility of trust, and the consequences of letting greed dictate actions. The church would eventually heal, but it would never forget the lessons learned from Jane's tragic end. The emotional scars left by the betrayal and the loss of a beloved colleague and friend would take time to heal, and the community's faith in its leadership would never be the same again. As for Peter, his future was sealed. The man who had once been a trusted member of the church community would now face the consequences of his actions, forever marked by the memory of the life he had destroyed, both figuratively and literally.